Two of the most famous and credible cases in ufology are the Falcon Lake encounter in Manitoba, Canada in 1967 and the Cash Landrum case in Texas in 1980. The witnesses in both not only said they saw something strange which they could not explain, but they bore the physical effects of their encounters. Intriguingly, in both cases, those involved believed that they had not seen alien spacecraft, but secret military manoeuvres. At Falcon Lake, Steve Michalak said a stereotypical flying saucer had landed in the wilderness area near where he was prospecting. He thought it was a US vehicle having engine trouble and approached to say hello. He saw no people or other beings before the craft took off, its engines blasting a checkerboard pattern burn onto his body as it did so. In December 1980, two women and one of their grandsons were driving along a lonely road in the piney woods when they saw a glowing object surrounded by Chinook helicopters. They stopped to observe and felt heat, apparently radiation from the object. Betty Cash, one of the women, was badly affected and suffered the effects of radiation poisoning. She lodged a claim for compensation against the US government, who denied it was anything to do with them. Betty died after years of medical problems, on the 18th anniversary of the fateful sighting. Both of these cases have been fully chronicled elsewhere. There are many other cases which have involved unwilling witnesses being burned by an alien flame. Let's review 10 incidents. The earliest report has been widely denounced as a hoax, ever since 30-year-old Dunham Sanborn Desverges, known as Sonny, stumbled out of a Florida swamp near West Palm Beach in 1952, claiming he had been attacked by a flying saucer. It was a hot, sultry night on the 19th of August, when Sonny, a hardware store clerk by profession, was driving on a military trail with 3 Boy Scouts from Troop 33. Bobby Ruffing, 12, David Rowan, 11, and Chuck Stevens, 10, when they saw a light flash low in the sky, which they thought might be a plane in trouble. Sonny pulled over and grabbed a torch and a machete. He instructed the boys to remain in the car for 10 minutes, then, if he had not returned in that time, to go to a nearby farmhouse and raise the alarm. The young man hacked his way through dense undergrowth for about 4 minutes, until he emerged into a grove. A sickening odour filled the air, and Sonny had the uncomfortable feeling of being watched. A heat, likened to that from an oven, blasted over him, and looking up he could see no stars, and realised something 30 feet wide and black was hovering above him. It was a seamless circular object, with a phosphorescent glow around the rim. As he backed away, he could see it was a saucer about 10 feet high with a convex dome on top. Suddenly he heard the noise of metal moving against metal, and thought a hatchway was opening. From the side of what he termed the ship came a red light like a flare, which slowly moved towards him. Instinctively he protected his eyes by balling his hands into fists over the sockets, as the light turned into a red mist and engulfed him. Then he felt himself lose consciousness. He regained his senses leaning against a tree. His eyes were stinging and he could not see properly, as he frantically pushed his way out through the bush towards the road. His eyesight slowly returned to normal as he went, until he emerged from the vegetation and stumbled babbling onto the road where the boys and local authorities were gathered at about 10:30 p.m. It was an hour since Sonny had gone into the bush, although he only remembered less than 10 minutes of that time. The scouts had been able to follow his progress by the beam of his torch for some of the way. They had seen a semicircle of white lights descend into the trees, and then a red glow. They decided they had better go and get help from the farmhouse at that point. Palm Beach Deputy Sheriff Mott Parton and Lake Worth Constable Lewis Carroll had answered the call and were discussing with the boys what had occurred when Sonny reappeared. The deputy, who had worked in law enforcement for 19 years, said later he had never seen anyone as terrified as Sonny that night. He was shaking and his face was white. The group were taken back to the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office for questioning. There it was noted that Sonny's hat had 3 small burn holes in the bill, and the hair on his forearms was singed, and the skin looked burned. A team from the United States Air Force Project Blue Book came and obtained statements and took samples of grass and soil from the location of the sighting. The roots of the grass had been charred black by intense heat. At first the Blue Book investigators thought it was a credible report, but they changed their mind when they discovered that Sonny had been dishonourably discharged from the Marines for car theft in 1944, although the charges were later dropped, and that some people said he had a great ability at telling tall tales. They finally decided that the boys would not have been able to see the red light from their vantage point, and believed Sonny had concocted the tale and supporting evidence to have a story to sell to a newspaper, for which he hired a press agent. Later he told stories of fighting with aliens in grey clothing in stories he sold to the press, which further eroded his credibility. He also said he received anonymous phone calls at work saying he should not talk about UFOs, and was followed by a black automobile. But there was the grass. The only way Blue Book could replicate the burnt roots was to heat grass in a pan of sandy soil to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Nobody is really sure if it was a hoax, or if an unreliable individual had experienced something real and uncanny. 10 days later, on the 29th of August 1952, a family group, Mr. and Mrs. Wendell Wells, their 15-year-old niece, June Tent, and 2 children were on their way to a drive-in when they saw a glowing object descend into the forest, just as reported by Des Vergers and the boys. They chose not to investigate. Sonny died in Florida in 1993 at the age of 70. 5 years later, 2 sentries were burnt by a UFO at Fort Itaipu, Brazil, on the 4th of November 1957. The 2 men were at the highest point of observation at the fort, at Praia Grande, near Sao Paulo, facing the dark Atlantic Ocean at 2 in the morning. Over the sea they noticed an intense orange light. At first they thought it was just a very bright star, but then realised that it was growing bigger as it came directly towards the fort. The light came right up to the fort before it stopped, and hovered about 300 metres above the startled soldiers. Then it began to slowly descend, until it was only 50 metres above them. The men could see now that the source of the light was a circular craft 100 feet across. It sat in the air making a whining noise similar to an electrical generator. Both were armed with submachine guns, but were frightened and thought it unwise to try shooting at the strange manifestation. They were so scared that they could not even move to sound the alarm. Without warning, an invisible heat source struck them, setting their uniforms on fire. The heat was so strong that one man passed out. The other soldier cried out in fear and pain as he dropped and crawled under a cannon for protection. His screams alerted the rest of the garrison, but as they awoke the electricity went out, plunging the fort into darkness. Even inside the building the air temperature was raised slightly by the strange energy. The electric clocks, which had their alarms set for 5 a.m, all began ringing throughout the fort. After about 3 minutes the heat subsided and the lights returned. The troops rushed out, the first outside, seeing the light disappearing into the night sky. Of their comrades, one man was still unconscious, while the other was crying and dazed. They were taken for medical attention and found to be suffering 1st and 2nd degree burns to 10% of their bodies, mostly on areas that had been covered by their clothing. Once notified of the attack, the Brazilian military scrambled jets to patrol the area, and with the assistance of the United States, closed the fort and investigated the matter. It was kept secret for 2 years, while details slowly leaked out, before it was finally confirmed. Brazilian investigator Dr. Olavo Fontes was denied permission to interview the 2 men, only being informed that they were undergoing treatment for their burns at the Central Army Hospital in Rio de Janeiro. They were there for 2 months. Today the fort is a tourist attraction, which anyone may visit. Why the soldiers were attacked remains unclear, but strange things were occurring early in November 1957. At Levelland, Texas, on the nights of the 2nd and 3rd of November, a number of cars were stopped by an unseen force as UFOs hovered above. On the same day the fort was attacked, another mass car stop occurred at Oro Grande, New Mexico. One of the witnesses reported suffering from sunburn after the event. On the 3rd of November, the USSR had launched Sputnik 2. Was something trying to send a message to Earth? 2 days after the events in Brazil, on the 6th of November 1957, at Merrim, Indiana, A 33-year-old ironworker named Rene Gillam noticed a light outside his home. Stepping out to see what it was, he found himself looking up 1,000 feet at an unknown object, 40 feet in diameter. It was bathing the area in an eerie, penetrating light. Rene stood watching the object for 10 minutes. His wife, children and father-in-law also saw it. The object was briefly joined by a smaller object, which departed. Then the main object made an electrical motor whirring sound and also left. Numerous people in Sullivan saw two objects in the direction of Merrim at 6:30 p.m. on the 6th of November perform the same manoeuvre, but the time of the Merrim sighting isn't known, so it isn't conclusive they saw the same event. The next day, his face began to redden and grow itchy like a very painful sunburn. On the 8th of November he went to his doctor. Dr. Joseph Drake said it was not an allergy, but similar to burns from the glare of working with an arc welder without protection. 2 days later his condition had worsened, so he was taken to Mary Sherman Hospital in Sullivan, Indiana. Hospital staff refused to discuss the case and allowed no visitors. By this time the military had been alerted to the case. Rene's condition eased on the 11th and he was expected to be released the following day. Nothing more was announced about the case and it was quickly forgotten by most. Years later, two investigators were told medical records could not be released to them, and, anyway, a small fire had destroyed them. On the 10th of November 1957, a woman in Madison, Ohio, saw an acorn-shaped object hovering behind her garage for half an hour. She developed a rash on her body and had trouble with her vision. A doctor commented she had symptoms suggestive of radiation poisoning. A spate of reports came in following the sighting of a UFO and two humanoids by a patrolman named Lonnie Zamora at Socorro, New Mexico on the 24th of April 1964. The Socorro sighting remains one of the most famous UFO reports ever. On April the 28th, 1964, a 10-year-old girl named Sharon Stull at Lowell Elementary School in Albuquerque observed an egg-shaped silvery UFO as she returned from lunch at home around 12:30 p.m, which she stared at for 5 to 10 minutes. Other children, including her younger sister Robin, saw it too, but were not particularly interested in it. About half an hour later, while in class, Sharon's face and eyes began to burn. A doctor diagnosed conjunctivitis of the eyes and mild sunburn on the nose and under the eyes. The doctor supposedly believed her story, but many people felt that it was a hoax. On the 2nd of June 1964, a similar case occurred, but there was no doubting something really happened this time. In Hobbs, New Mexico, Charles Keith Davis, an 8-year-old boy, had gone with his grandmother to a laundromat she operated at 600 East Marland Street at around 4 p.m. Stepping out the back door of the laundry into an alley, he saw a strange object in the sky. He said it looked like a big black top. Then it swooped down at the boy and set his hair on fire, and when he ran into the laundry, his skin was falling off his face from 2nd and 3rd degree burns. Yet his t-shirt was undamaged, which Mrs. Smith used to try to smother the flames, before a neighbour doused them with water. His grandmother also saw the object, but struggled to describe it. She said it was a long burner, ablaze at one end with dark smoke coming out of oblong holes. She also heard a hissing sound at the same time. Charles was hospitalised for 2 weeks and spent another month at home recuperating from the injuries he received. He could not see for the first few days. The t-shirt, his grandmother's blouse and some burned scrapings were sent to the FBI, who promised they would advise them of what they found. Nothing more was ever heard. Charles was interviewed by UFO investigator David Marler in 2019 and still didn't know what he had encountered 55 years before. 1973 is referred to as the year of the humanoids due to the plethora of reports of UFOs and strange, often spacesuited figures all across the south of the United States, mainly in the autumn of that year. In September 1973, a 45-year-old truck driver, Eddie Doyle Webb, was travelling with his wife, Velma May, near Cape Girardeau, Missouri, in a tractor-trailer rig. Around dawn, at 6:15 a.m, he saw an aluminium-coloured object coming up fast behind him. He woke his wife, but from where she was sitting she couldn't see anything. Eddie stuck his head out of the window to get a better look, and was struck in the face by a large ball of fire, which knocked off his glasses and temporarily blinded him for several hours. His vision never returned properly after the incident. Eddie managed to pull the truck to a stop as the UFO moved away. Velma, who was his relief driver, drove her husband to hospital. His glasses were retrieved, and it was found that the plastic frame had softened and warped, causing one of the lenses to fall out. The state of Durango in central northern Mexico is largely rural and sparsely populated. At a small ranch near Mapimi on the 22nd of January 1977, a 50-year-old man and his 16-year-old daughter, called Licha, had been visiting a relative. On the way home they decided to take a shortcut. As they drove along they heard a noise similar to an electrical power plant, like the soldiers at Fort Itaipu had heard, but they could not see anything to cause it. 5 minutes later a silver ball appeared in the sky, and they began to feel affected by it. At home the man's wife was listening to the radio, and when a program ended at 6 p.m. she began to worry that he and her daughter were late. Their journey should not have taken so long. Then her husband appeared with his face and arms burned, as were his shirt sleeves, looking as if someone had used a blowtorch on them. The man was upset, on the verge of tears and frightened. He explained that their daughter had been burnt, but not badly, but had been taken to a nearby hospital. The girl had recovered by the 7th of February, though bearing the scars of the encounter. She and her mother spoke to a UFO investigator who had been trying to seek them out. They refused to give their full names or even their address. People who had heard their story called them crazy, they explained, and they just wanted the incident forgotten. 6 months later, in June 1977, while riding along a quiet country road in County Durham, England, Mark Henshaw noticed a light behind him. At the same time he felt an intense heat through his helmet and clothing. His motorbike's engine cut out, yet it still felt as though it was moving forward, as if pulled by something. The petrol tank felt hot to the touch. Then the light vanished and the invisible force acting on the motorcycle ceased. A few days later Mark developed blisters on his hands and arms, which lasted for several days. At 3:32 a.m. on May the 13th, 1978, a 32-year-old Kerman police officer named Manuel Amparano was on routine patrol near Kerman High School. He was ex-Marines and had been a cop for 5 years. Local teenagers had been setting palm trees on fire, so when he saw an oval-shaped reddish fireball, slightly smaller than a full moon, in trees, he thought he had caught some of them in the act. Then he realised there were no palm trees there, only oaks and maples. The light began to rise, and Manuel attempted to train his spotlight on it. There was a bright blue flash, and the light made a sharp turn and moved off rapidly toward the southwest. Manuel had not left his car, and because it was a cold night, his windows were wound up. He had heard no sounds from the object. Checks with aviation, meteorology and military revealed nothing unusual had been spotted on their radars. A check at the cotton field where the sphere had been hovering revealed nothing, but for years nothing would grow in the immediate vicinity. The only tangible evidence of the encounter was that Manuel seemed to have been burned by microwaves. His body looked like he had been sunburnt, with small white blisters. The burns occurred through his clothing, but not through the car door, only where the window glass had been. His eyes became sensitive, being easily hurt by sunlight. After a few days off, he returned to work. The only lingering effect was that due to his story being related in the Fresno Bee, he was contacted by lots of women wanting to go on dinner dates with him. A corroborative report was made by a Kerman resident named Lisa Harrison. Unable to sleep, she heard a whining noise and felt her house vibrate at about 3:30 a.m. Looking out her window, she saw 2 lights flying south at treetop level. Her neighbour also heard the noise, which she likened to the rattle of a faulty air conditioning unit. Manuel remained a police officer until 1992, when injuries he received helping to quell a bar brawl caused his retirement. In 2002, when interviewed, he said he wasn't sure if it was some sort of government device or something alien, but it was definitely a UFO. Around 11 p.m. in Western Mill Hill, Plymouth, England, on the 10th of September 1981, people in two households noticed that their dogs were acting as if scared and nervous of something. At 11:15 p.m, their neighbour, Denise Bishop, aged 23, exited a taxi and began walking toward her parents' home. As she approached the back door, she saw some lights behind nearby buildings. On the doorstep, as she stood about to use her key, she saw the source of the light. A dark metallic grey object shaped like the body of a crab, 125 feet across. It was shining down beams of light in hues of pink, purple and white on the neighbours' roofs. As she had no interest in UFOs at the time, she looked at it amazed and perturbed, as a thin lime-green ray shot from the craft and hit her left hand. Instantly she was paralysed. The light remained on for about 30 seconds. She noticed it was solid, not giving off any illumination. As soon as the beam stopped, she was able to continue opening the door, and hurried inside as the UFO lifted away. Denise told her sister what had happened, and the two women checked outside, but there was nothing to see. Her sister checked the hand which had been hit by the beam, but it looked okay. However, a few minutes later, her sister's dog began sniffing the hand, and Denise felt a sting. There were now spots of blood on her skin. She went and washed the affected area, which now looked like a burn, which hurt for a couple of days. After a week, a scab had formed, and after 3 months, she was left with a pale splotch resembling a birthmark. Reports of being burnt by strange craft seem much rarer since 1980. Maybe the UFOs tightened up their health and safety procedures. Maybe stories of abductions and missing time deterred witnesses from lingering about or getting too close. Or maybe, like the people from Durango, anyone unfortunate enough to be burned by an alien flame, just keep quiet and let such matters reside in the dark corners of history.